Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven, and we're joined today. Our guest is AmyJo Mattheis. She is the founder and CEO at Pavo Navigation Coaching. She has worked in international development, government, higher education, and religion. She's been a professor and a pastor. And she works a lot now with high-tech startups. She's managed teams, built roadmaps, facilitated groups, navigated boards, set vision, and led thousands of people to bring them into form. So AmyJo, thank you for being here today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. It's always fun to hear your bio summarized like that. It's like, oh, I did do all that stuff, didn't I? It's kind of like a reminder, a nice reminder, So thank you. It's fun. And I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, well, good. Well, hearing that hopefully then is a bit of a positive boost, get you hyped up to have a good conversation here.
Definitely.
AmyJo's website, and we'll mention this again at the end, and it'll be in the show notes, is pavonavigation.com. That's Pavo navigation.com. So there's a lot we can talk about here today, AmyJo, but so my wife is Amy, so I'm going to have to make sure I don't just out of muscle memory say I apologize, AmyJo. No and my wife listens to these episodes sometimes, so she's going to hear my mistake. But okay, that's behind me now. AmyJo, we've heard my most recent mistake. What would you say, looking back at your career and all the things you've done, what's your favorite mistake?
Yeah, I love this question. And I've been thinking about it a lot in preparation for this podcast today. Because of course, as I said, when we met earlier is like, gee, which one do I want to choose? Because I've certainly made a lot of them. And I think I have three. And I'm going to start with the third one first, which is because literally before getting on this call with you and your listeners, I was just coaching somebody else in the startup world, and we were just talking about this, which is the mistake of needing to know the answer or needing to think that I had to be right. Right. And what I was sharing with my client is, when I was a pastor, I'm a biblical scholar, and, you study for 4 years in graduate school. You come into this position where you're supposed to be this leader, and you're supposed to have, quote unquote, the answers, the right answer, the right way of understanding. And I felt both like good and not good about that, because I'm an excellent scholar, and I felt really strong about being able to communicate that. I was also a young woman, and coming into a congregation full of all kinds of not young women, and so what I found was that people were not shy about telling me when I was wrong, or when they perceived me to be wrong. And what I wish I would have done, because what I did was I argued with them.
Yeah.
Right? Because here I'm the theologian, I'm the biblical scholar, I'm the one who spent all this time investing and researching and studying and learning Greek and learning Hebrew and all this stuff. So I would argue about, because these were very topical things that we were discussing, right? LGBTQ rights, women's rights, environmental actions, how do we understand these scriptures? And so I was very passionate about it. And so I think that instead of arguing it to be right, what I would do now, and what I do now, is I allow for curiosity to lead instead of being right to lead.
And do you mean your curiosity when you're being challenged, or the person you're maybe debating, arguing with?
Right. It starts with my curiosity, because if I get curious, then I create space for them to be curious. And so for instance, in that situation with the scripture, which is kind of a good example, actually, because like my perspective and perception on scripture is, it's always interpreted by every single human who interacts with it. And that's true for everything, right? So it's going to be true for any kind of thing that we are all debating about or talking about or looking at. And my way of thinking is there isn't ever just one right or wrong way to look at something, right? So that curiosity, even though I have a very strong stance, like, so let's take, for instance, the LGBTQ question. What I wish I would have done with my parishioners is said, well, you are 100% right that there are multiple ways of understanding these words and these texts. And your way of understanding them is certainly one of them. My foundational belief is that this book that we call the Bible is primarily, its foundational belief is that every single human is precious and valued as they are. And so your way of looking at this violates that for me. So I can't affirm that. But it's like, it would have been like not making them wrong and me right, but opening up the conversation to allow for more, and then that allowing for more conversation.
Mm-hmm. So when did you start becoming aware of this dynamic that you're arguing that might not have had a positive effect, or it might have been frustrating, or both? Like, when, I'm always curious, like when do people start getting an inkling or start to discover that, okay, wait a minute, this might be a mistake?
Right. Well, that leads me to my second favorite mistake that I wanted to offer your listeners, which is staying too long in a role and in a place that you just know it's time to go, right?
So what was that situation?
Well, how many times do you want to learn? Like, definitely being a pastor. I think definitely when I was leading an international nonprofit, like I knew I knew I needed to go because I knew that. Let's take the pastor piece. I had outgrown that. And I had come to another understanding about, for me, what I believed was true about how the world works. So I could no longer, preach something that I did not support anymore. And attached to that, and it's the same thing with the international nonprofit. I understood that that no matter what I did, the dysfunction in the board and therefore the programs weren't going to change. And in both places, and I see this with my clients now too, all the time, like we think it's our responsibility to fix something that's not working. Like I'm going to fix this. And usually, and I think this is a great piece of wisdom for all of us. No, you're not.
Yeah.
Like that's
not for everything.
Like,
yeah,
you're not, well, especially for, systemic processes and systems that were in place before you got there. And maybe if you're in a startup, weren't in place before you got there, but have been part of developing or been part of participating in. If they're dysfunctional systemically, they are not something that one person can change or fix or make better.
So going back when you said you had outgrown the role of being a pastor, you didn't just leave and go to a different church. Do I understand right? You stopped being a pastor.
I did. Yeah. Because there's a lot of reasons for that. One, as I referenced earlier, I came to understand that I no longer believed the story. And part of that was because of the exclusivity and the separation that I witnessed it creating. And I just couldn't continue to support that. The other piece was being a woman in the church and being a woman leader was incredibly difficult. Talk about going into a male club profession. I mean, that is the ministry, right? That is one of the oldest, and it's alive and well. And so it was the two together. I just couldn't. Actually, let me restate that. The two together, and this is an answer to your question previously of like, how do you begin to notice, right? I was, anxious more often than not. I was always worried about how I was going to be perceived. I was over preparing for everything and still not able to get done what I wanted to get done. And this goes back to the needing to be right all the time and arguing my case, right? Like the reality ended up being that the congregational members and the leadership, they just weren't going to do it no matter what. Like they weren't going to start the preschool. They weren't going to vote for what we in the Lutheran Church called reconciled in Christ congregations, which would mean we were open to LGBTQ pastors. Like they weren't going to vote for that. They weren't going to, even though I had done quote unquote everything, right. We'd had all these educational classes. I'd prepared everything for the preschool to start, and the other two, like it wasn't that I was wrong or did it incorrectly, but there comes a time, I think, where we look honestly at the landscape that we're in and we admit what is real. And that can be incredibly challenging to do, because once we see the landscape for what it is, then we get to make a choice.
Yeah. And so it sounds like in both of those kind of types of mistake, of the wanting to be right, the arguing, the staying too long in a role, that there was a pattern, and at some point you had the recognition of the anxiety and the worry, and you kind of trace back, well, what seems to be causing this? Is that fair to say? Yeah,
sure. I mean, and always like those, the feelings of the I call them our somatic indicators. Like our body is one of our best allies, who and they give us all kinds of signals about this stuff, right? And so not sleeping consistently, feeling a tightness in my chest all the time, having a nervous tummy, and I think too, simple things like just not having fun, being stressed all the time, feeling like I was needing, and this is really true for a lot of people in their workplaces, feeling like I'm needing to walk on eggshells all the time. Like I have to be very careful about what I say and to whom I say it to and how I say it. And those are all indicators of, I think, work environments that are not healthy places to grow and learn and innovate and create in.
Yeah. And I've had a couple of other guests talk about listening to your gut and developing intuition, and they'll point to similar things like you were saying, like there's something to be said for listening to your gut of like, I just feel constantly uncomfortable in a certain situation. And maybe even if you can't explain why, that recognizing that feeling could either say, well, I'm going to remove myself from that situation, or maybe I can figure out why. And then I think you raise a really good point. Is it fixable or not? Can I fix it, or do I need to just remove myself and find something someplace else?
Right. And I think one of another question that goes along with that, is it fixable, is what is mine to fix, right? Which is, even if I might say, yeah, it's fixable, then I look at my role and my purview and say like, okay, and what is my arena of choice here? And will that have impact? You know, and if anybody's feeling any of this, like in any of your listeners in their workplace right now, one of the things that I recommend my clients do is, you know, once they've asked the question, is this fixable? And what is the arena that I have choice in? And they identify something that they can choose to do that maybe may amend it, may adjust it to the point that it's okay to be there. Set a timeline for yourself. Like, okay, I'm going to take this action. I'm going to follow this process. I'm going to give this feedback, and I'm going to say, I'll give it 4 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever, and for some adjustments to be made, because part of what happens is we take steps and then it takes forever, and then leadership doesn't respond, and then we're waiting, and then pretty soon a year goes by and 2 years go by, and what happens is we get hurt, you know, we get wounded, and we're also not very good at that. We're also not very good at expressing that and allowing ourselves to talk about the wounds from the toxicity. And so we get bitter, and we get angry, and we get kind of brittle, you know, and that's not good for us, and it's not good for anybody else. It's not good for our family. And that's how toxicity spreads.
Yeah. Yeah. Because people start snapping or kind of lashing out, and you're not sure, well, why, but it's that deeper rooted frustration.
Yeah.
Out, right?
And also I think they, you know, I'll say we back to being careful and cautious. And so maybe we have a question, but we don't ask it because we're afraid if I ask the question, I'm going to expose that I don't know something, or it just doesn't feel safe. And if in a work environment doesn't feel safe, what happens, to put it in a general space, is we shut down. And when individuals shut down, so does communication, so does innovation, so does, problem solving. All of that shuts down. Right.
Yeah. Without, as some frame it, and I'm a big fan of the work of Amy Edmondson at Harvard. I'm hoping she'll be a guest on the show here to talk about what she frames as psychological safety. The feeling safe to say, in a nutshell, I'm paraphrasing, feeling safe to say what's on your mind, to speak up with ideas, right, to speak up about problems, and that you're not going to be blamed, bullied, harassed. I'm paraphrasing, but I think directionally,
yeah, that's
true to what she has seen from her research. Without psychological safety, you can't have innovation or problem solving. Absolutely. Or improvement. Our brains shut down. Our fight or flight instinct, our reptile brain takes over, and that's not good.
Totally, 100%. And the thing is, right, is it doesn't have to be this way, but most workplaces actually operate like that, without the psychological safety, because my perception is because we have learned that domination is the way to get people to do what we want them to do. Fear and goals that are impossible to meet, are set for the sales team because that's what's going to get them motivated and going and competing, as opposed to achievable goals, right? And so when we lead with domination and fear and threat, that's what we get. We get it back.
There's probably an evolutionary trait or two in that mix of what was helpful for prehistoric people, and some of this for different reasons may be, natural selection of more of a male trait in a lot of ways. Of what was helpful in the past doesn't serve us well today.
Absolutely. And, I think one of my areas of scholarship is in the history of how patriarchy came to wipe out matriarchy and matrilateral cultures, which also were associated with goddess worship and sacred feminine, as opposed to patriarchy, father rules, and sky god, and monotheism, and all of that stuff. And that is a very interesting, massively understudied arena that also talks about how we got to domination as opposed to collaboration. So I think it goes back to, when we're running away from saber-toothed tigers, but I think there's also another piece of the history there that the patriarchal tribes from the steppe region over a period of thousands of years, just overwhelmed the other cultures, and they were warriors and these people were not. And that's also how we came to get to where we're at today. So either way, what we know is it's really, really deeply ingrained in us.
Yeah, right.
Like we've all learned it very, very well.
Yeah,
for sure.
So AmyJo, before we talk about, I'd like to talk a little bit about your work, in Silicon Valley. But you had a third story that you wanted to tell.
Thank you for remembering that. Yeah, my third one is a lesson that I learned the hard way. And it's this lesson that the company will never love you back. And you can take out company and put anything in there. So for me, the first time I learned it, it was the church was never going to love me back. The institution is not going to love you. And this is a hard lesson for us to learn. In fact, I was just talking to a client about it today, which also affirmed like, okay, I'm going to talk about this with Mark, because we love our companies. We love products. We love our teams. We love, we spend all our time there. And so we give and we give and we give. And oftentimes we're, especially for startups that are scaling quickly, kind of asked to cut ourselves and give our blood. And there's a point in there where we need to realize this is not going to be remunerated to me. Like, yes, I am receiving an excellent comp package and I have equity and that's as it should be, right? And that's for 50 hours a week kind of thing. It used to be 40, right? Now,
right.
Like we can say average people are working 50, 55. When those boundaries need to continue to be set. Right. And one way to help liberate ourselves to do that is to say, wait a minute, this company isn't going to love me back. I'm going to give until they don't need me anymore. And when they're done with me, they're going to let me go. Well,
and so that does not sound like you could use words like love or loyalty. Or there's that transactional, I'm working super hard, they're compensating me well. That's different. That's transactional as opposed to a longer term commitment between the company and the employee. And there's probably this fine line where, this is not the old, there are downsides to the old Japanese model of lifetime employment. Mm-hmm. My dad had one paycheck his entire life, and that was General Motors for 40 years.
Yeah,
I've had a very different path where I've had, and so there were times where I felt like, there was one time a company was not loyal to me. I got laid off by a company a few months after 9/11 and eventually had a chance to come back to said company, which, was fine. And then there are times where I've left companies for good reasons where I feel like, at least in one case, they felt like I wasn't returning the love. Mm-hmm. The loyalty or the investment they had made in me. But I'm like, well, my wife's taking a job in Texas. What can I do? But I think, people are going to view it the way they view it. So it's interesting to think of those changing dynamics, not just around work hours, but what is the expectation around loyalty?
Yeah. Ooh, loyalty is a good question. I mean, that, it's funny. I was just with a founder that I'm coaching this morning, and we were talking about setting up the system. What's it going to be like? And they were saying, I think it would be really excellent to integrate a program where we tell all our employees, look, there's going to be a time when we're going to separate from each other. We know that. Either you're going to choose to leave us or we're going to ask you to leave, right? Like you're not going to spend your whole life with us. So one, we just want to make that clear so that everybody's aware of that. And two, that doesn't mean you don't love the product or love the company or love your work or have loyalty to it. It just means that there will probably come a time when something like your wife taking a job in Texas means that you need to separate, or you feel like you've learned all you can here and now you're ready to move on to the next place, or like there's all kinds of reasons. But instead of making them like negative or making that somehow like not loyal or wrong, presencing it right in the beginning and saying, and so therefore we have this program where when you depart, this is the severance you'll get, and you'll get a coaching session with our coaching team, and you'll get access to our network so that to help you move to where you want to go next. It's such a much more unifying, freeing, allowing model, right? And the funny thing is that will keep you loyal, right? Like if you leave that company who's actually helped you have a healthy departure and also given you support for your next step, you're going to talk about that company highly.
Yeah. There are companies in different industries that are known for having a strong alumni network in different ways. It sounds like an example of what you're describing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, So I wanted to also ask though, when you talk about Silicon Valley, and I think you and I, AmyJo, are aligned from what I've seen of how you describe situations that mistakes are learning opportunities in some way. Whatever happened in our past, including our mistakes, forms who we are today. So we're aligned around that. And I know personally, I'm hard on myself when I make mistakes. I try not to be hard on others when mistakes are made. But, in Silicon Valley, the one thing I think is really fascinating is this idea of supposedly embracing failure, fail fast, fail early. Is that easier said than done? Like companies or Silicon Valley as a whole can, spout's not the right word. That's not a nice sounding word. They can spout these ideals, but then when it comes to us as individuals, and as complex as individuals can be, long question shorter, is embracing fail fast, fail early easier said than done?
Absolutely. And I keep in mind that is a phrase meant for the product designers and the engineers, right? Companies are a whole lot more than that. No offense to the engineers and the product designers out there. But we're talking about they're wanting to build these exciting new tools. And so, fail, go ahead and risk it. Go for it. Take the risk. If it fails, awesome. We'll learn more. And the area where it's easier said than done is allowing that to be true throughout the entire company. When you're setting up, roadmaps and process for how you do your HR team, for how you handle your financing, how you do the sales, how do you do marketing, how all of those need to have that applied as well for it to really, really be true. And we don't tend to do that. Like you said, we're hard on ourselves. We're really hard on others too, when mistakes are made. And I have, not only are mistakes okay, but they're necessary. Like we need mistakes, because that is one way that we learn, is when we are doing something and a ball drops and we're like, oh crap, didn't see that ball. Okay, missed that one. Or when we are all involved in rolling something out that's new, presence that. Like, instead of, because our instinct is to, okay, I'm rolling this new program out, I have to know everything for everybody in the entire company, as opposed to saying, hey folks, rolling out this new process that we're all going to be interacting with. It's new for everybody. So let's all, bring awareness to when it's working and when it's not working. And let's point that out in a way that will help us improve it, as opposed to attacking somebody, for something not being, right. Or, and then finally, I'll just end with my definition for failure, which is like associated with mistakes, right? My definition of failure is simply missing the mark. And as I was talking about this one time with a client, I realized, oh, that's just the scientific method, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Like you're setting a hypothesis. This is where I think I want to go. I want to go to X. X is my deliverable. And so then you set out to do X and you actually end up at Y. And you're like, oh God, how did I end up at Y? And then you look back and you see and oh, okay, well, I've learned now, I've learned that doing these things didn't get me to X, it got me to Y, and then et cetera, et cetera. And when we can allow for that, like, it's all about allowance and permission for those interactions with mistakes and failure to be the one that is predominant, as opposed to, I did something terrible, I made a mistake. That means I'm awful at my job, or it means I don't know what I'm doing, or it means, that is when they become empowering, as opposed to defeating.
Yeah. And I think, there are some connections drawing back to some of the stories you told early on, around needing to know the right answer, being right, versus discovering, testing hypotheses, understanding the difference. And this is different than a Silicon Valley setting. But when it comes to, let's say, scientific method and scientific problem solving, coaches I've had coming out of Toyota, a manufacturing company, will often ask, what is knowledge and what is an assumption? What do you know and how do you know it? And I think sometimes people, they get stubborn in being right, even if data or market forces or other things may be disproving a hypothesis. People dig in, they get stubborn, and they confuse what we know versus what we're assuming to be true. And I think those are interesting ideas. I'm involved in a software company, KaiNexus, that would still be considered, probably still calls a startup. And even in sort of like these older industrial companies, it's interesting that there are, I think, parallel lessons of, you could call them cognitive biases or traps that we fall into. And I'm sure you see that's a lot of what you're coaching people through, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, we can just take this and make this one nice big little bow here, because that's also exactly what I experienced as a pastor, right? Like, people dig in to a belief and quote unquote proof for that belief because it makes them, or well, let me back up and say, because they have a perception that that is safe, right? And if I accept a different understanding of this, then that's going to change my whole world. And it doesn't even matter if it means, like in the case of the congregations, that we will be able to thrive and expand and increase our numbers, and take good care of our facility and be able to help a bunch of people. I would actually rather choose a crumbling facility and less people coming every week, because that feels safe. that feels like I'm going to keep my world intact. So in the case of business, yeah, right. Like even if you have data and analysis and you're presenting something like this is going to make us more money, it still can be very difficult to accept that different worldview, which, cognitive bias is a fancy way to say, yeah, like I am committed to this way of looking at the world.
Yeah, all evidence or data be damned. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and that is really incredibly powerful for people. For me, I mean, for all of us. I'm not separating myself from any of this.
Sure.
Evolving our understandings of the world and how it works for me is that it is ongoing, right? And it can be challenging to allow that to be true.
Well, AmyJo, thank you so much for sharing some of your stories, and I think and your reflections and your learning. I think from your own career and how you've brought that into your work with others. I think it's really interesting to hear about those connections. So thank you. Thank you so much for being a guest.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
So our guest again has been AmyJo Mattheis. And she is the CEO and founder of Pavo Navigation Coaching. You can learn more about AmyJo and her firm and her work at pavonavigation.com. And again, I'll make sure there's a link to that in the show notes. So thanks again. Really, really interesting discussion today. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. This has been fun, Mark. Thanks.